Hello, dear friend. Thank you for hanging out with a couple of multiples today. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System. We are a married couple that both have dissociative identity disorder, or DID.
The reality of living with multiplicity is nothing like what you might see in the movies or on soap operas. This mental health condition often goes unnoticed, even by mental health professionals. Did you know that someone with DID spends an average of 6 to 12 years in the mental health system before receiving a correct diagnosis? This is because there is still a prevailing belief, even among clinicians, that DID is rare. The truth is that there are around 120 million people all over the world that meet the criteria according to the DSM-5.
We are glad that you are here to learn all about dissociative identity disorder. Whether you are someone living with multiplicity, a supporter, or a mental health professional, you are making a difference by choosing to listen to this podcast today. You can help dispel myths about DID and help spread awareness by sharing this podcast with a friend or loved one.
Please visit acoupleofmultiples.com and sign up for our mailing list to learn all about our private paid community called Hearts Multiplied on the Circle platform. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review. And for our Apple listeners, we would really appreciate you leaving us a written review.
Together, we can make a difference by taking the disorder out of dissociative identities. We are honored to have a Gold Plus sponsor for Season 2.
The Institute for Creative Mindfulness is one of the largest EMDR therapy training programs in North America, founded and directed by Dr. Jamie Pless-Marich, author of Dissociation Made Simple. Dr. Jamie is the only EMDR therapy trainer who is out as a plural, and since 2015, she's offered the full EMDR therapy basic training in a way that honors lived experience and destigmatizes dissociation in clinical work.
We have never felt more accepted and validated as a multiple than when we were able to show up authentically as Garden System for our basic EMDR training. Having lived experience is valued and respected in these training courses.
Go to www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com for a full list of upcoming trainings, both online and in person, offered by Dr. Jamie and her selected network of EMDR trainers.
Are you interested in becoming a sponsor? Please send an email to admin@acoupleofmultiples.com to request more information.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our phenomenal season finale of Season 2. The crowd goes wild. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System,
a couple of multiples.
The reality of dissociative identity disorder.
Before we get into our topic, we want to spend a moment celebrating with all of you, our dear listeners. This season finale is our 24th episode. That's 24, and we realize we wouldn't be doing this or be experiencing the success we have had without all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. We are happy to announce that we have listeners from 51 countries, 6 continents. Come on, Antarctica. Someone please take a cruise to Antarctica and download an episode from there.
Oh my God.
And we are thrilled to announce that we have had, drum roll please, 9,000 downloads in the 6 months that we have been doing this podcast. So listeners, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so very much.
We have had some incredible conversations this season about internal communication, as well as some oh-so-important conversations with our intriguing guest speakers. For our season finale, we're going to dive into denial of having DID and coming to acceptance of being a multiple in a very singleton world and the impact of internal communication in these areas.
We also want to touch on the feelings of shame. Shame is a common feeling for systems to feel, and it's also a really hard place to be. I know I have felt stuck in these feelings of shame at times, and it's really challenging to live your best life with those feelings weighing you down.
Shame is such a weight to carry around, and it's not even ours. It doesn't belong to us. But our perpetrators lied to us, and now we carry it ourselves. Being a multiple is hard because of all the reasons we developed into one in the first place. And for many, there is a wish to not have this, to not have DID. Denial of this and denial of the trauma happens often. We've experienced these moments throughout our healing recovery, and it can feel extremely confusing, especially on days where the internal communication just isn't happening.
For my system, the shame caused what I like to refer to as the Lizzie show. In past episodes, I have brought up myself, Lizzie, the part of me that has been the one usually out most of the time. When I look back on how this occurred, it really had to do with shame. I couldn't remember what was being taught in my classes because of the switching that was happening at school and in my life in general. So I, Lizzie, one part of the system, decided that it would be best to stay present, or at least try to, for the entirety of our school day. This meant that I was functioning as just one piece of my whole system of parts for hours on end. And it became a thing. And that thing was basically masking that I was a singleton and not communicating or acknowledging my other selves. This did not last and could not last into my adulthood. My other selves started taking over at times because of essentially being ignored and pushed away and not having time out in the body, which caused me to experience time loss and amnesia, which just added more shame.
The shame really causes a cycle of denial. There's a shame for the abuse and having this dissociative disorder, which leads to attempting to appear, quote, normal, which leads to system chaos, at least in our experience, which restarts the feelings of shame all over again.
Sounds like you just described a shame cycle. The cycle of trauma, DID, shame. Yeah, you're welcome, people.
Being a multiple is rather complex, and it means accepting that knowledge of the unspoken things that we endured. And in my experience, there is often a particular self that desperately just wants to be a singleton and to make the others go away.
Uh-huh. So true. Continue.
Our self that went by the body's legal name often struggled with this denial. Our inability to function during those years was a huge source of shame for her. She didn't understand why we couldn't just pull up our bootstraps and get on with life.
And intellectually, we know that we are tough cookies, having survived the trauma we endured. So this whole idea of being able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and just get on with it, well, yeah, we know we could do that at times, technically. So since we know we are tough, our minds kind of harass us with this idea that we should just forget about it all, move on and ignore, push away all the pain, and not acknowledge the trauma or our parts for that matter.
Yeah, like we just try to make it all go away. We remember shortly after attending the Healing Together conference for the very first time, we were really experiencing some huge denial. We even messaged the people we shared a room with at the conference to tell them we had made a mistake and that we couldn't have DID. That one roomie immediately texted back that we most certainly did have DID and proceeded to talk about how Snow, our white Siberian tiger self, came out in the middle of the night and growled, literally growled. We felt absolutely horrified hearing this story.
I remember the first time one of my cat parts meowed at you, wifey. It was really early on in our relationship, but I was co-conscious, saw and heard what had happened while it was happening, and was absolutely horrified. Later, you told me that Snow, your tiger, had been out when I had meowed at you. So, well, it all made sense and we laughed. But seriously, it's funny, even though finally meeting other people with DID is such a relief, and a part of you, literally, finally feels like they have come home, that you have found your people, it also triggers denial. I experienced the same "I'm making this all up" feeling after the first time I attended the Healing Together conference. The question is, Why does this happen?
Dude, I have no idea. Why does this happen? Maybe because there's a belief that life in general would just be easier if we were one single person inside this body. Maybe because we don't want to believe or accept the trauma that has happened to us. Maybe because we just want to fit in and belong in this world and not feel so completely lost because there's so much we just can't remember from day to day.
Yes. Yes, all really good reasons for denial. And also, I was just thinking, when you meet someone else with DID and you get the chance to observe from an outside perspective, it makes sense that one would be like, nope, that's not how I look or sound or am, because, well, we don't see ourselves. We just kind of have our internal experiences to go off of, and that's it. Also, hearing other system stories at the conference causes comparisons like, oh, my life really wasn't that bad, or I don't experience DID like that person at all, etc.
Well, considering that most people are more covert than overt, it makes sense to feel like, I must be making this all up in my head, or to think that maybe you're just having mood swings. But in my experience, we don't get to dwell in this state of denial for too long because parts will just come crashing back in to remind you that they are indeed still there.
Yes. I was about to say, yes, unfortunately. And that goes to show you that the feelings of not wanting this diagnosis to be a multiple, the not wanting the trauma to have been a very real part of our life, the sick feeling in the pit of your stomach about all of it is an intense reality for a lot of people with DID.
Another facet of denial for us has been pretty recent, in fact. We're in a pretty stable and functional place in our life right now, and more often than not, Sadie is fronting. And this gives us the appearance of being a singleton sometimes, and sometimes we get so caught up in all the things that Sadie is doing that we get this false feeling of singleness. Then we went to the beach, and immediately Daisy, our 3-year-old part, who is loudly saying she has aged up to 4, pops out to splash in the waves, and the rest of us are like, yeah, that's right. We are a we. That stability almost had us fooled.
It's true. When a system is further along in the healing process, the denial can happen again. We aren't DID anymore. And then you pause for a moment and think, yeah, we aren't DID anymore. We definitely didn't say an I there. Yeah. I was talking to a very close friend the other day over dinner that considers herself far along in the healing process, and she said that when you've achieved a certain level of closeness, togetherness, whatever you want to term it, functional multiplicity, or in some people's experience, fusion, the separateness that once was in the system just isn't there. What used to be very separate parts can still get activated, but don't really have a separate experience anymore. The challenge of having DID comes up in life events still, but the separateness at some point no longer is the main challenge. But I think it's safe to say that denial of one flavor or another pops up throughout a person with DID's life.
What are some ways you have experienced denial? I know that some selves have acceptance of being a multiple, but others are deep in denial.
Yeah, I definitely do still have a part that is deep in denial, as you said. She does go by the body's legal name, which is Amber. She was the one that was more or less running the show when we were married in our early 20s to our ex-husband. She went dormant when we got divorced. I think her severe state of despair and what caused her to go dormant. And she stayed that way for over a decade. When she came back into the body a couple of years ago, she was in a whole different state, over 1,000 miles away from where she remembered last living. She didn't know where she was at. The body was more than 10 years older, and we had married a woman with 4 teenagers. To say she was shocked was a gross understatement. She immediately wanted to fix and change this life she wasn't involved in creating. But of course, this caused system chaos because all of us who had been around and worked so hard to have the life we have created wasn't about to see her change everything without her even realizing or accepting we exist at all.
She wasn't really part of the team, so to speak. The irony sometimes is in the denial. The irony sometimes in the denial is that we actually argue with ourselves about this diagnosis. This fear that we are just making all this up can get strong, and oneself just tries to take over, believing they are the normal or healed one. Sometimes our adult selves get real blendy, meaning they experience a partial, temporary integration. And when that happens, the doubt of who we all are sets in. I think being in denial and coming to acceptance is an ongoing loop in our healing recovery.
Yes, acceptance is an ongoing thing for sure. Perhaps not even a destination to one day arrive at. Although perhaps some people with this diagnosis can say, yes, I and my full totality is in complete acceptance of being a multiple. But in my opinion, more often than not, if you are a we, you most likely experience looping through phases of denial and acceptance.
The important takeaway is that experiencing denial and struggling with acceptance is common. You are not alone if you struggle believing this diagnosis is your reality. For a few years, even after my therapist had given me this diagnosis, I still worried that I had just somehow faked it so good that I fooled myself and her. I'm not even sure exactly when this faded away. There wasn't any one point in time where I was like, here's my foolproof event or fact that undeniably proves I am a multiple. Rather, it was a very slow acceptance of acknowledging, listening to, and believing my own experiences.
And like you brought up earlier, Garden System, not only is there an overall denial and acceptance of being a system, but also individual parts varying degrees of denial and acceptance, which makes the whole challenge that much more challenging. Perhaps one's overall level of denial or acceptance is based on the varying degrees of acceptance by one's system of parts. So I think in order to feel a little more congruence and less chaos, working on the individual parts denial and heading towards more acceptance will help the system along as a whole towards being in an overall state of acceptance.
So it's down to internal communication to combat this denial that overcomes us.
Indeed it is. And by golly, that just so happens to be what we've talked about this entire season. Internal communication is so important and is the key towards acceptance.
Really, it's when other selves start making themselves known that we have to be like, yeah, okay, we have got we going on in here. For us, this acceptance was so difficult, though. Ourselves that lacked the trauma memories were running the show, and acceptance of others also meant accepting that our so rosy childhood wasn't as rosy as we were recalling it. Our trauma happened at such a young age that it really got wrapped up nicely and hidden from the rest of us. We had done such a good job of dissociating that we were unaware that those memories were ours. It was a very heavy and sick feeling that we had as we started to realize that those memories were us.
What happened? What helped your others that did not hold trauma memories or were holding different aspects of the trauma memories you experienced come to accept these memories are all real and valid and a part of yous?
Lots of therapy, honestly. Having my therapist see, hear, listen, and talk to my different selves was extremely helpful. She could validate that fear and confusion for our adult selves while also holding space for the truths that Jenny and the others were sharing. One of the hardest pieces for us is accepting the fact that we will never fully know our whole story of what happened between the ages of 0 to 6. On one hand, we don't have a ton of visual flashbacks, which sort of feels like a blessing. But it's confusing trying to understand all of our body and emotional flashbacks with no visual or very little visuals to go with it, it makes the acceptance all that much harder. The few visuals we do have feel like some sort of dream, and we question the reliability of our memory. But here we are, as a we. The evidence is just too strong to deny it.
So when your therapist saw, heard, and listened to your others and their memories, do you remember your others talking to her about their memories? Or did you ask them? Or did they tell you? How did you come into awareness of what they do hold and know?
We became more aware of each other internally through therapy and increasing our ability to be co-conscious. We started being aware of when Jenny was out and could hear her use the body to talk. It felt like we should have been able to control what she was saying, but we couldn't. Her memories just started bleeding through to the rest of us.
In what ways did the memories start bleeding through to the rest of yous?
Well, we could start seeing and feeling what Jenny saw and felt. It was like we had access to her memories where we didn't have access before. It was an awakening in the adult's awareness of what happened. We started having a visual where there had been no visual, and our adult's knowledge could see and understand things that Jenny could not. It was less her memory and more our memory.
I know you mentioned in previous episodes that Jenny is your gatekeeper. She controls what access many of you have to memories. What helped Jenny let others in the system have access to these memories?
It wasn't 100% in her control. She might be our gatekeeper, but she is not all powerful. Initially, she didn't want anyone else to see these memories and did her best to block the rest of us. That had been her job for years. But our therapist helped all of us to see that it was unfair for Jenny to hold all this trauma by herself. We were willing before Jenny was ready to share, so that was helpful when some things would slip through anyway. We were finally ready for what was to come. Seeing how the rest of us handled the memories helped her to gain trust with us until it was okay for her to let the rest of us in. This had to be done in Jenny's time, which has been about a 3-year process.
We identified earlier that internal communication was key to moving towards acceptance. In what ways do you feel internal communication helped all of you accept the memories Jenny was holding?
As my therapist pointed out, Jenny has no reason to lie. And when we mindfully dug deep down into our soul, we knew it was true. Refusing to believe Jenny was like abandoning ourselves. We just weren't going to do that to ourselves. We had been, and meaning Jenny had been, abandoned enough when the body was young. It was time to be there for ourselves. It was time to accept Jenny, to accept us. It wasn't about using words, but more about just holding that space for her.
We have established that internal communication does not always mean parts talking to each other, because we know there are a lot of other ways to communicate besides talking. Seeing or sending picture images from part to part is one way to communicate internally. However, communication doesn't always have to be internal. Having a part draw or make art to communicate, or having parts write to each other to relay information out in the external world are other ways to communicate. My little Ramona recently came up with the idea of buying a journal notebook to give to Amber, our part that I mentioned earlier that goes by our legal name, that is in denial of the diagnosis and having a system of parts. Ramona wants each of us to write or draw to Amber in the journal notebook to introduce ourselves, tell her how old we are, what we like, and so on. Ramona thinks this may help Amber realize she really does have a system of parts and help her start connecting with all of us.
Journaling is a great technique for internal communication. It's helpful to hang on to these journals over the years. When you look back, you can have that confirmation of your multiplicity, and you can see the progress you've made in your healing recovery. For us, Jenny isn't so much of a talker, but rather there are a lot of visuals of her in the internal world. Most of her vocabulary centered around saying no and telling us to go away. When Leanna finally found her room in the internal world, Jenny's response was to turn off the light and drown us all in darkness.
Do you think Jenny reacted this way out of protection? Like she wanted to save everyone from the horrors she endured? Or do you think she felt shame for what was there and that's why she reacted this way? Or...
Well, Jenny will say she was protecting everyone. But we're pretty sure Jenny held a lot of shame for still living in that room. In our last episode, we explained more about the house where Jenny's room was located. It was a house where trauma reenactment was occurring. That house is now gone, thankfully. Jenny hid there because she knew the trauma was real. There are so many people out there that don't understand the trauma they endured because it was their normal. Our main traumas didn't happen in our home, but we still didn't know about it because we had locked it away. And we had heard repeatedly growing up from our parents about how good we had it. They didn't know what had happened to us, and their insistence on this great life we had just made, it just made us suppress the trauma even further from consciousness.
Yes, hearing over and over again as a child how good we had it, how lucky we were, causes such an intense amount of shame when things weren't okay and weren't good. Family or friends saying it couldn't have been that bad, or I don't see you having other, quote, personalities, deepens the shame and denial. Coming into acceptance of our system of others can feel really confusing and lonely, which is why finding support, a therapist and or a community is so important. Back when I was first diagnosed, I found several online communities I became a part of that were for survivors. It helped. And then my therapist told me about Jamie Pollock and the Healing Together conference in Orlando. The connections I've made from these communities reduced my shame a lot. I found my people, my chosen family that believed me, and I was no longer alone. After starting this podcast, we reached out to all of you, dear listeners, and we asked you what you'd like to see most besides the podcast. The majority of you wanted a private online community for those with lived experience, supporters, and clinicians alike. So we created it.
Yes, we have. We have a private, dedicated space where all of you, dear listeners, can choose to join and participate. We have message boards, live events such as chats that run like those old school style AOL chat rooms for people who like to keep their camera off, and live video chats for those that like to have the camera on. You can start building connections, friendships, and ask questions of others. There are spaces for everyone, whether you are someone living with a dissociative disorder, a supporter such as a friend or family member, or a mental health professional. Some spaces include everyone, and some spaces are kept separate. And you have the flexibility to choose which spaces you want to participate in and which you would rather not see. And this allows therapists and clients to choose their personal boundaries when participating in the community. We are hosting live events for those with lived experience and live events for clinicians to consult with other clinicians about treating dissociative disorders and trauma. Our community is hosted on a platform called Circle, and it is unsearchable. You will only hear about it through us here on this podcast, our website, and our social media accounts. In order to join the community, you will first need to sign up for our mailing list at acoupleofmultiples.com. And then you will receive a link to sign up for a free informational meeting where we will let you have a sneak peek and answer all your questions. The community is just $10 a month with 2 months free when you pay annually.
If you have any questions about the community, please email us at admin@acoupleofmultiples.com and we would be happy to answer your questions. It's been an amazing season, and we want to thank all of you from the bottom of our hearts for listening and for your continued support. If you would like to make a donation to help contribute to our many projects, including the podcast and our online community, please visit our website, acoupleofmultiples.com. On our website homepage, there is a button link at the bottom that says Support a Couple of Multiples Here. We are so excited to announce that Season 3 of A Couple of Multiples will be all about relationships in DID. Relationships with family, friends, and romantic partners can be challenging when you have a dissociative disorder. We can't wait to tell our own personal stories about how we have navigated relationships and things we have learned from each other, our own therapists, and also other support people in our lives. We also plan to have some very special guest speakers to talk about this so important relationships topic as well. Please stay tuned for the highly anticipated start date of Season 3. Until then, thank you for hanging out with
A Couple of Multiples. We are honored to have a Gold Plus sponsor for Season 2.
The Institute for Creative Mindfulness is one of the largest EMDR therapy training programs in North America, founded and directed by Dr. Jamie Plesmarich, author of Dissociation Made Simple. Dr. Jamie is the only EMDR therapy trainer who is out as a plural, and since 2015, she's offered the full EMDR therapy basic training in a way that honors lived experience and destigmatizes dissociation in clinical work.
We have never felt more accepted and validated as a multiple than when we were able to show up authentically as Garden System for our basic EMDR training. Having lived experience is valued and respected in these training courses.
Go to www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com for a full list of upcoming trainings, both online and in person, offered by Dr. Jamie and her selected network of EMDR trainers. Thank you to our bronze sponsor, Alex Amar, LCSW, who offers weekly creative art classes, including the Creative Journal, Soul Collage, and Altered Books, all on the Zoom platform exclusively for people living with dissociation.
For more information, check out her website at alexamar.com, spelled ALIXAMAR.com, or her Facebook page, Dissociative Creative Explorations. Are you interested in becoming a sponsor? Please send an email to admin@acoupleofmultiples.com to request more information.
From your host, Drew,
And Garden System.
thank you for listening to A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder. This podcast is intended for educational purposes and is not a replacement for therapy.
Listening to this podcast does not constitute a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any guest speakers.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We would love to hear what you enjoyed the most.
You can visit our website at acoupleofmultiples.com for additional information, including how to join our new online paid community called Hearts Multiplied, to access additional resources, and to also subscribe to our mailing list to receive future updates.
Remember, you matter and are loved for being all of yous.